Welcome. This is our second in a series of 5 presentations about our pastor's faith inspirers. For those of you who were here last week, we had Pastor Patrick, and this week we have Pastor Jacob. Next week will be myself, and then Olivia, and then Pastor Larry will be closing us out. So things to look forward to. Also, just a little bit of a plug. The Adult Formation Committee is hosting a night out to see The Color Purple on Tuesday, this coming Tuesday, and it's at the Signature Theater, just right down the road. So if you haven't bought your tickets yet, there's still a couple more available, so I'd love to have you. If you have any questions about that, just find either myself or Jacob. We can answer those questions for you. Those are all my announcements. Do you have anything else you'd like to share?
See the show.
Yes, Sean. All right. I'm going to open with a word of prayer, and then I'll pass the mic over to Cindy. Let us pray. Good and gracious God, we thank you for the rain. We thank you for this water that is quenching the earth. God, we are fearful of the rain as we watch our siblings in Florida and South Carolina. Their lives are being destroyed. We ask for your healing power. And we thank you for this day. And yet we are also fearful of this day, of what the future might hold. May your healing hand come into our lives and lift us up as we continue on this journey towards the home you are calling us to. In Jesus' most precious name we pray. Amen. Take it away, Red.
Thank you so much. You called me Pastor Jacob. You are also Pastor. What is that? Off. Fans off?
Yeah.
Here you go. I'm just going to put this over here in case I need to use or anything. First off, thank you all so much for being here. I am thrilled to be able to lead this course this week. So February, maybe, of last year, Larry was like, here's a course that I think would be kind of fun to organize. And he put together a beautiful one-page sheet that listed a bunch of ideas. And that was then shared with the Adult Formation Committee. And the Adult Formation Committee gave their own twist to those ideas. You know, iron sharpened iron with that idea, I guess. And it's this, and that's that each, clergy person is able to share who some of those folks have been that have been either theologians or pastors or writers or influences that have specifically inspired us in our faith journey. Patrick's was wonderful. It can be seen online. Is that true? It's recorded? Yep. So if you missed it last week, it's available online on our website at the YouTube page as well. But this week, I'm going to specifically speak about folks who throughout my faith journey have shifted paradigms for me, have shifted my perspective and the way I think of power. And so I'll do my best to share them and how they've done that at different stages in my life. But yeah, how many have ever seen the old Saturday Night Live skits with Chris Farley interviewing Paul McCartney? Yeah, where he's just like so excited to be interviewing Paul McCartney. He's like, remember when you wrote that song yesterday? That was awesome. He's just so overwhelmed. I sometimes get overwhelmed talking about these folks that inspired me. So I will do my best to, let's see here, to not get too caught up in who they are, but to share how they inspired me, changed paradigms and whatnot. So Gary Dorian is this man. And Gary Dorian was the dean of Stetson Chapel at Kalamazoo College when I went to Kalamazoo College. I attended there for 4 years. All 4 years, Gary was the dean of chapel and the head of the religious department. While I attended school, I worked in the chapel doing a handful of different tasks. I was 18 years old and I was a wedding coordinator. Woo! coordinating 2, sometimes 3 weddings a weekend. Friday night, 2 on Saturdays. You think my facial hair is wild now? At that point, it was much bigger. Imagine me being your wedding coordinator. Gary Doran had no problem with that. Gary Doran's a prolific author, and he introduced me on how to do legit research, right? He was like, hey, here's these books. And I was low level, but still, go make a ton of copies, and here's the sections we need to do. When we were specifically interviewing families for some of the research, I had the chance to meet different people's families that he was researching and whatnot. So Gary Doran, right before I get to his bio, I took a lot of classes in college with Gary. I worked 3, 4, 5, sometimes days a week with Gary. Gary Doran's bio. Social critic Michael Eric Dyson wrote in 2021 that Gary Doran is the greatest theological ethicist of the 21st century. Our most compelling political theologian and one of the most gifted historians of ideas in the entire world. Philosopher Cornel West describes Gary Doran as the preeminent social ethicist in North America today. And philosopher Robert Neville calls Gary Doran the most rigorous theological historian of our time. Moving from analysis of social context and personal struggles through the most abstruse theological and metaphysical issues. Now, this is why you'll know that Gary Doran and I connect. Gary Doran says, I am just a jock who began as a solidarity activist, became clergy at 30, became an academic at 35, never quite settled on a field, and now I explore the intersections of too many fields. Gary Doran, like me, grew up in Michigan. Gary Doran, like me, played baseball in college. Gary Doran, like me, felt a call to go to seminary. Gary Doran, like me, felt called to look at how so many different fields mesh, what those intersections happen to be. Now, Gary Doran is an amazing thinker, right? I brought some of his books. The Making of American Liberal Theologians is a 3-part series. I mean, this is like foundational stuff, right? If you go to seminary, you're reading this. He also has branched out into a handful of things, such as neoconservatism, as well as being one of the preeminent Black social gospel historians of our day. One of my favorite stories that he shared with me is about how Dr. Martin Luther King ended up being the voice of the bus boycott. On day 2 of the bus boycott, Martin Luther King, freshly out of school, serving a new church, walks in late to a meeting where E.D. Nixon is admonishing the ministers for not being willing to stand up and make a speech about the boycott. Nixon is giving it to them, saying nobody was willing to step forward and speak for the movement because it was dangerous and in Montgomery could get you killed. Now, Martin's not in the meeting yet. He's a new minister. He's not running on time. So he is late, all right? He walks in late, goes and gets a cup of coffee, and does not like being called out. He doesn't like being named a coward. And so history in that moment turned because the newcomer was willing to take his life. That very night, he gave his speech at the Holt Street Baptist Church about the bus boycott. So this man, small town in Michigan, ends up not only influencing me, but being this amazing historian, theologian, ethicist, etc. The last thing, or 2 more things about Gary Doran. The first is that he currently teaches a class at Columbia called Justice and the World Order. I mean, he doesn't want to take that class, right? And the last thing is, and it says here, you should go to Union, right? Now, I, Presbyterian, I grew up and went to preschool, elementary school, middle school, high school, and college in the same 2-county radius my entire life, all right? I was scheduled to go on study abroad to Israel in the fall of 2001. Well, 9/11 happened and my program was canceled. And so I never really had an opportunity to do that, right? And so I was under care at this time of my local presbytery, saying, you know what, I feel a call to ministry. What does this mean? And they encouraged me not to go to Union. Union Theological Seminary, New York City, which is where I ended up going. They said I would get lost in the big city. You know, small town boy, me and John Cougar Mellencamp, you get the picture. Right? Gary went to Union after going to a small liberal arts school in Michigan, strongly encouraged me to go to Union. That's very fun, is that when I told him that around Christmas of my senior year that I would, you know, I'd been accepted mainly because of his amazing recommendation letter, that I was going to go to school there, he said, you know what, come into the office. He came into his office and he shared with me something. And he said, you know, I've told folks that the only way I'd ever leave Kalamazoo College is if I had the chance to go back and teach at Union. And 18 months later, my second year of seminary, Gary Dorian is the Reinhold Niebuhr Professor of Ethics at Union Theological Seminary, where he still happens to be. And I took classes with him also in seminary. So Gary Dorian has been very foundational. You can still find him at Union, and also as a member of the history faculty at Columbia University. Lives right up there at 122nd and Broadway. Next, Liz Theo Harris. I love Liz Theo Harris. Gary Dorian impacted me in one way. Liz impacted me on a much different way. The Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris, PCUSA, is co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival with the Reverend Dr. William J. Barber. She is the director of the Kairos Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice at Union Theological Seminary. She's an ordained minister in the PCUSA, teaches still at Union, and this is her most recent text. It's called We Cry Justice, Reading the Bible with the Poor People's Campaign. And she edited this, so she took together all these different devotions so many people wrote and put this together in this text. So I go to seminary, and to be very honest, some of the folks in my home Presbyterian weren't wrong. It was a little culture shock, you know, to go from, you know, Paw Paw, Michigan to Manhattan, right? And I did my first semester, and we have at Union, we had at the time, I don't know if they still do, something called a J term. And it's a January term, and classes are 2 to 3 weeks long. Often people do language during them, or they do some sort of travel experience, right? We had, 3 weeks in Columbia or 3 weeks abroad somewhere. Well, I took Liz's class called the Poverty Immersion class. And what I did for 2.5 weeks with 15 other students, led by Liz Theo Harris, was we intentionally spent nights in homeless shelters up and down the East Coast in January, and then would gather the next day and reflect on what we learned. And it was incredible. I spent nights in Philadelphia at a homeless shelter that intentionally served cheesesteaks. Like that was the food you got if you spent the night there, you get a cheesesteak. I spent a night in a handful of them in New York. I spent one of the best nights is I spent a night in Ithaca, New York, right? Where Ithaca, obviously the University of Ithaca, it's Cornell, is that right? Yeah. So the homeless shelter that I stayed in Ithaca was the only homeless shelter that had carpet. Interesting. You did not get food in that homeless shelter. You were given what's called Ithaca bucks. Because Ithaca has this, they have this sort of like, everyone agrees that if you were in town, that if you work a certain amount, you can get untaxed Ithaca bucks. That will then be able to be used at certain in-town locations. So the idea is that they're helping the local communities by doing that. I met different people at every single homeless shelter I stayed at. But in Ithaca, the guy I remember the most is a man named Ark, and Ark described himself as a gay polyamorous monk who was having a hard time fitting in, but loved being in Ithaca because of the way that this community embraced Ark. Talk about a way to change my paradigm, power, or perspective, right? It was by being in a homeless shelter. They didn't give out food, they gave out Ithaca bucks. You know, spending a night with a bunch of my colleagues and Ark, right? Food was such a fascinating thing to see in all of those different shelters. Some, actually, if you stayed there long enough, they would teach you classes on how to do food prep, and you could get a certificate where you hopefully get employed. But anyway, Liz Theo Harris. And so she says, what I see from Genesis on through the New Testament is a constant revelation of God's will that no one should be made hungry, sick, homeless, underpaid, indebted, or bereft by the violence of social injustice. Liz Theo Harris. The next person that I am going to share is a Frenchman with the name of Pierre Bayard. The first two folks I know personally, and I had the honor of attending their classes. I've never met Bayard. However, if any of you are on Twitter, you will see that I label myself as a post-Bayardian theologian, because I find what this man writes to be absolutely genius. He teaches at the University of Paris, and in particular, in a book that he wrote called How to Talk About Books You've Never Read. That's in dissertation, right? I'll just read this. The title of the work, its place in the collective library. Remember, collective library. The nature of the person who tells us about it. The atmosphere established in the written or spoken exchange, among many other instances, offer alternatives to the book itself that allow us to talk about ourselves, and I would argue, or the work, without dwelling too much on that work too closely.
Can I borrow that?
You absolutely, 100%. This is so important. And this, right? So back to my time with Gary Dorn. Even though I started as a religion major, I ended up as an English with a creative writing emphasis major, which I'm glad I had it. But anyway, which means I think in associations, right? I am not very good at facts. But I can be like, this text has this theme, so does this one, how do they work together, right? And what Bayard does is he says, sure, you need to know the material in this book, but you also need to know where it fits in with the other works of liberal theologian history, where Dorian, the author, fits in with other authors that are writing about this material, not just now, but throughout all of time. Who else in this is mentioned and what is said about them? And to think about it, not again, just, hey, what does Mark Twain say in Huck Finn, right? What does Charles Dickens say in Great Expectations? But who are the other famous English lit authors? Who else wrote about horrific child poverty, situations in London? Mark Twain, right? What does Faulkner say? How do those fit together? And so again, Bayard, just completely shifted the way I think about works, whether they're art, whether they're literature, whether they're TV shows, what have you. If I'm ever in Paris, I'm looking this guy up. All right, next we have Melanie Harris. Now, Melanie Harris, fun little story about Melanie Harris. Melanie Harris and I know one another, not super well, but she was a student at Union while I was a student. I was getting my Master's of Divinity. She was getting her PhD. The other really famous person that was getting his PhD at Union while I was there is a man known as Senator Raphael Warnock. And so what's fun is that Melanie and he were TAs, folks that I learned from while I was in school. So Melanie Harris, this congregation knows very well because I quoted her in a sermon from a long time ago at the very beginning of the pandemic. That's what she said that I'm going to quote you from is not the basis of most of her work now. But what I said about Melanie, no problem, in a sermon is that she once said,
It's me. Sorry.
no problem,
I forgot to leave it in my car.
is that think about the image that ties Christianity together. The cross. The cross was an image from over 2,000 years ago. Violent, brutal. What is a better image, Melanie's word, that brings humanity, Christians, people of faith together now? And she said the wireless router, because that's what brings us all together. Now, she said this in like 2012, 2013. She said this before the pandemic, but I remembered it and included it in a sermon right like April of 2020, whenever that was. And only one person said that was, sacrilege heresy. I do remember that Melanie has been quoted by me in sermons. Melanie is fantastic. What Melanie is much better known for is that she is a Black feminist and womanist theologian. She works both at Wake Forest School of Divinity and the African American Studies at Wake Forest University. And Dr. Harris is also known as the director of the Food, Health, and Ecological Well-Being Program. Some of her more famous books are Gifts of Virtue, Alice Walker and Womanist Ethics, Eco-Womanism, which is my favorite, Earth Honoring Faiths, and she's the co-editor of Faith, Feminism, and Scholarship, The Next Generation. She earned her PhD and MA at Union and has an MDiv from Illiff School of Theology and Spelman College. Melanie Harris says African cosmology connects the realm of spirit, nature, and humanity into one flowing web of life. Now, as someone who spent 3+ years studying eco-theology, creation care, it's very easy for someone like me to say Teddy Roosevelt, John Muir, Bill McKibben, and just sort of name folks like that are very prominent, that do amazing work caring for the earth, but that also look a whole lot like me. And don't necessarily give other perspectives into how we have relationships with the earth. And what Melanie does, and what our next person do, is they have definitely, as I've read them, as I've talked with them, and as I've shared with them, have again helped open my, expand the paradigms that I have or had going into those conversations and really rethink power. Randy Woodley. Now, Randy Woodley happens to be one of my dissertation advisors. And Randy Woodley also grew up in Michigan. He's a public intellectual, author, activist, farmer, and a wisdom keeper. He's a recognized leader in the field of indigenous and intercultural studies, ecology, spirituality, race, and theology. He happens to have a wonderful podcast that any of you, just look up Randy Woodley and it will come up. He writes numerous texts, but he also wrote this children's book that, little heads up, is going to be what we share with our children in our children's ministry next week, as it's a holiday weekend. So he wears many hats: podcaster, children's author, scholar, dissertation advisor. Through his teaching and leadership, he invites indigenous and non-indigenous people to decolonize and indigenize their worldview and practices so they can learn to walk on this earth in a good way. Randy is Cherokee descendant, recognized by the Kee-Tawa Band. Now, this says Shalom and Harmony Way. How many of us are familiar with the Hebraic concept of Shalom? I'm sure it's been preached and taught about before. Randy wrote a book where he takes 7 different indigenous tribal ethics, right? All 7 of these are from the Pacific Northwest, where he currently teaches in Portland, Oregon. And find they all have this shared thought, right? Think about what they are, right? What do they all have in common? What do they have in a shared library? And they all share this concept of the harmony way. The harmony way means living together in right relationship with one another, with others, and with the earth. And he wrote this fascinating book comparing that with the Hebrew concept of shalom. And so he writes, a society concerned with shalom, or harmony way, will care for the most marginalized among them. God has special concern for the poor and for the needy, because how we treat them reveals our hearts, regardless of the rhetoric we employ to make ourselves sound just. Shalom and the harmony way is a communal, holistic, and tangible way of life. There is no private or no partial. The whole community must have shalom or the harmony way, or else no one has shalom. or the harmony way. As long as there's hungry people in a community that's well fed, there's no shalom. Harmony way is not for the many. While few suffer, nor is it for the few while many suffer. It must be available for everyone. Oh, Roger, I love you, but I'm not going to give you control of my screen. So, decline. So clearly, right, I went to a small liberal arts school, and I pointed out that the man that gave me the most, instruction was also a man from that same state, Michigan, Episcopalian priest, Gary Dorman. I then went to Union Theological Seminary in New York. My training has been Western, right? And when I turned in and submitted and defended my dissertation, what this man, Randy Woodley, said is that in the Western context, from an indigenous perspective, what I created was as good as it can be because I took into account the relationship that we all have with the earth. That's some of the highest praise I've ever received. So, Randy Woodley. I have many more that I'm not going to go into as much, so there's room for conversation and questions. Dorothy Day, right? I mean, talk about someone who lived it, also inspired Liz Theo Harris, but oh my gosh, Dorothy Day. James Cone. James Cone is the founder of Black Liberation Theology, professor of mine at Union Theological when I was there. What Randy said was pretty great. I'm very honored to have gotten that. Also, one day James Cone wrote me a recommendation letter. Like I deserve that. But seriously, this man changed the face of theology and the way it's studied when he wrote and when he taught. And his legacy will live on forever. James Cone. Maria Harris. So for those of you that don't know, Maria Harris is, I'm the associate pastor of Christian formation here at the church. And Maria Harris wrote a book called Fashion We a People. And it, to me, is the Bible of what Christian formation means. We've taken classes, if you've been a part of them, on what is Christian formation, and she's one of my most quoted and favorite Christian educators. Also, Maria Harris is a Catholic nun. Just fun little tidbit, but I've actually had numerous Catholic nuns that have also helped me along in my career and my call. Malcolm X. So a lot of people feel like the Martin and Malcolm, what is their, are they, well, to be very honest, I think that Martin Luther King, in large part because he was Christian, in large part because he was nonviolent, was, or still is seen as more of an acceptable 60s black radical, whatever, however you want to describe that, as someone that we should say, hey, this person, spoke to me. But of the two, Malcolm X is the one that speaks to me more, and I will tell you why. Similar to Gary Dorian, similar to Randy Woodley, Malcolm X is from Michigan. Malcolm X's mom was institutionalized in the state mental institution in Michigan, in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And I remember driving by the state mental hospital where his mom happened to have been institutionalized. Malcolm X moved to New York. Remember the kid was in Atlanta, but I've never been to Atlanta like that. Malcolm X, New York. He worked in Metro North. I've taken Metro North trains. And Malcolm X's nickname was Detroit Red. Why? Because he had red tinge in his hair. And so Malcolm X, I love his autobiography. One of the most spiritual moments of his life was when he went on the Hajj, and he saw people from all around the world worshiping together at the Kaaba in Mecca. And the fact that Malcolm X is one of his most foundational formation moments took place during worship, and seeing the global concept of what that can be, I find it to be very powerful. So Malcolm X. Oh, I skipped to ahead. I'm so sorry. Larry Rasmussen. All right, this man wrote this book, Earth Honoring Faith, and is an absolutely incredible ego theologian. He taught at Union, but before I got there, I quote him a lot in my dissertation. I do my best to quote him when I preach. But I had the chance to meet him a couple of different times, and he was just so kind. He is like, "Oh, you're studying this? How can I be of help?"
Wow.
And he's like this world-renowned, travels all over the place, and gives services. If you have the time, and you want to learn anything about eco-theology or creation care, this is the kind of book I recommend. Now it's over 400 pages, but it's absolutely fantastic. J.R.R. Tolkien, love me some Hobbit, love me some trilogy. I was not a very big C.S. Lewis fan as a child. And so, but I like this guy better, which again is kind of like, oh, aren't you a Presbyterian minister? Yeah, but I like Tolkien better. And I will close with Nora Tubbs Tisdale. Now, I was very lucky that the very first church I ever served in New York, at Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church, while I was there for a year, Nora was our theologian in residence. All right? And Nora, she's an incredible thinker, preacher, speaker, and she has taught preaching at Princeton Seminary, at Yale, at Harvard, at Union, right? Like she has an amazing career and is incredibly profound. But she wrote this great book called Preaching as Local Theology in Folk Art. And probably the tidbit that has impacted the way that I serve a congregation the most comes from this book. It comes from Nora. Now, we are taught in seminary Greek and Hebrew and how to look at original texts and who wrote what when and what does Tertullian say and all of this different stuff, right? And that is called exegeting a text. What does it really mean? What's the core theme? What does that say not only for the people who originally wrote it, but specifically what about us for today? And what Nora says is to be a good minister, be a good preacher specifically, but to be a good preacher, you don't only have to exegete the text, but you have to exegete your community. So for instance, I could find out what the core tenet of a text means, but I'm going to preach that differently at this congregation than I would at any of the congregations I served before, because we are a different community of faith. And so what Nora says is you've got to do that as a preacher. What I say is I have to do that as a minister. I have to do that as an educator. I have to do that as a colleague. And the better I exegete my community, the better we all minister together. So thank you, Nora. I think that's it. Let me just triple check. But each of these folks, yes, have helped shift paradigms that I thought were there beforehand or move them. Definitely has impacted and expanded my perspective and has shown me the power in so many different voices and so many different ways of thinking. I'm going to stop share and ask if there are any questions. Yes.
You said that you studied religion in college. What motivated you to do that? Where were you in high school? I mean, we heard Patrick last week talk about, he was with IBM lobbying on K Street.
Yeah.
What were you doing in high school or college that got you doing religion?
Yeah.
And gave you the call?
Sure. So I grew up in a small Presbyterian, well, it's not small. I grew up in like a 250-member Presbyterian church in the county seat of Van Buren County called First Presbyterian Church of Paw Paw, Michigan. And if Larry is right, and when he shared a session on Wednesday, the average PCUSA church now has 70 members. A church of 250 is pretty sizable, right? And so I grew up there and, went to church every Sunday, very, very active. And you'll get a kick out of this. My mom was an elder and my dad was the Sunday school teacher, which is sort of a gender reversal from how a lot of that works, right? Traditional. I would also argue there's not a whole lot of male associate pastors of education or formation in our denomination. And that is the only thing I have been for 15 plus years. I feel strongly that some of that stems back from that experience I had just as a child growing up. I felt very called to be active in the church growing up. As a child, helped lead worship, lit candles, read, preached once when I was in middle or high school, that sort of thing. Being a minister, having no idea what it really meant, was the only thing that I ever felt truly called to all the way through school. So, there was going to be some day when the band wasn't going to make it big, right? I was never going to be Derek Jeter. I played enough baseball to know the dream was over, right? And however, so I went into college intending to be a religion major and then go on to seminary. Like that was the plan from very young. Not the most fun thing to go on college visits and say, hey, I plan to become a minister. You are? Didn't necessarily invite me to the best parties. But I will say that was the goal, right? That was the plan. I don't have an amazing, I'm in a clearing and there's a light, scales in it fall from my eyes. I don't have anything like that. But that's the only real thing I've ever wanted to be that made sense and has continued to make sense throughout my life. That said, I didn't know if seminary was going to work, right? And so I changed my major from religion to English because I also picked up a secondary ed teaching certificate while I was an undergrad, so I could teach at a middle or high school if seminary didn't work out. And what's interesting is my favorite semester of school was when I did my student teaching. I taught 12th grade regular and 12th grade AP English, and was the assistant JV basketball coach, which is like the ideal gig. And my mentor teacher introduced me to the class and then stayed in the library the rest of the semester and just said, hey, figure it out. And it's what I needed at the time. Wow. It's only been further and further honed as I've gotten older, as I've gotten older and it's been developed. I don't know if that helps answer the question, but yeah, thank you. Great question. I'm sorry I didn't answer that earlier.
Could you say a little more about how you exegete a community as it relates to your preaching?
For sure. So, I will give an example of a church I served in the past as a struggle point, right? As a growing church. So when I was at Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church, which is a huge church in Midtown Manhattan, who had fought against the city to allow homeless people to sleep on our steps, right? We had brought a lawsuit to the city of New York on homeless people to sleep on our steps. It was a big deal, right? What was our ministry? Homeless. What was our ministry? Amazing downtown worship, right? Great choir, great preaching, amazing space, Midtown, go to brunch after. That was who and what we were. And there were a few people who said, you know what? I think we need to change course and we need to become, because there's so many young students here, a congregation that does campus ministry. Now, there's churches close to Columbia, close to NYU, close to Hunter, close to City College that are doing amazing campus ministry. Instead of, for instance, saying, how can we support them? Those voices said, let's instead do campus ministry. That was like a 4-week effort that, of course, went nowhere because that wasn't true in what we were, right? So the better I know who and what we are, the better I lead, the better I teach, the better I preach, right? Part of that is both knowing the congregation, but that's also knowing where we are in the journey of our life together, right? I mean, this is amazingly not in good taste, but I mean, if I on Easter start talking about Reformation Sunday or something like that, I mean, obviously that's not a good job of exegeting the community, right? Unfortunately, my colleagues often suffer from this the most in times of trouble, right? After something devastating, what does the congregation need to hear? Might not always be what the minister needs to hear. The preacher needs to hear. And how can that be held in tension faithfully, collectively? Yeah, no, absolutely. It's law is an art, medicine is an art, you know, and I'd say that theology, this is something we practice, you know. Yeah. Anything else?
When are you going to write a book?
I'm going to write a book. Great question. Do you know about, well, I mean, I wrote a dissertation.
Yes.
And I have submitted that to places for publish. We'll see if that happens.
Yeah, once you have your PhD, you have to write a book.
That would be awesome.
He wrote a book.
Yeah, yeah. The you know, lifelong learning, the publishing sphere. That's all I got. Yes.
Another personal question.
Please.
As I understand it, your wife is a totally different career and profession than yours.
Yes.
Where did you meet and how did she come to want to marry a preacher or a minister?
Yeah. That answer's out of my field of expertise. But so my wife Sue works in the counterterrorism sphere, right? In particular with biological weapons and stuff like that, emerging infectious diseases. So Sue and I went to the same high school, and we were good friends, but never were in a relationship, you know. And then we went to different colleges and different grad schools. And I mean, no one's going to ever hear this, but there's a band out of Grand Rapids, Michigan called Mustard Plug. Everyone check them out. They're in Baltimore later this month. No joke. Anyway, and we were at a Mustard Plug concert together, and we were like, you know what, we have a good time when we're together. Do we want to try this long distance? And we did. And you know, I was in New York at seminary, and she was here at Georgetown. And that's in large part why we live where we live, is because before we were married, Sue worked at a tower in Bolton. And now we live, you know, 2 blocks away from that, because that was the area that she knew, you know, when it was time to come back to this part of the world. So yeah, I mean, like, we joke about how, you know, there's things she can't tell me, well, there's things I can't tell her, you know. Yeah, she definitely has a much, you know, she's a very unique position, and very lucky with it. Yeah.
What's the title of your book?
Oh, the Green Lectionary. So my dissertation was first elevator pitch.
Right.
So how many of us are familiar with the Revised Common Lectionary? Yeah. So there's texts every single Sunday in a 3-year cycle, cycled after Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the 3, you know, synoptic gospels, as well as texts from the Torah, the Psalms, and the Epistles. And many different people say that the best way to get your congregation, your community, your church, your school involved in thinking about creation care is by actually going out into the world and doing something, right? Like, let's do a river cleanup, let's make a garden, let's do a big project and put solar on the roof. And what I argue is that the best way to do it is by using scripture, because there already are words found every Sunday in the texts of the Revised Common Lectionary that point us to a stronger relationship with one another and with creation. And so it's called the Green Lectionary. We'll see if anybody, you know, where it goes, but it's definitely
A real page turner.
it's been, well, my hope. So yes, practical theology
Sounds, yeah, like
is the realm, right? Right? Like, this is not practical theology. Right? This is heady. You know, this is you know, how many parts per million we're ultimately breathing the same air that Derek Jeter and Julius Caesar breathed. Sweet, like, you know, that's amazing, that's moving. But this is, you know, how can you use the resources that are already there, minister, educator, parent, that have been in place for years. All you gotta do is take a look at, and then you realize, oh my gosh, there is such this strong connection, you know? A few years back, last year, we had Bill Brown from the Seminary in Atlanta, Columbia. come in and he joined us virtually. You know, I mean, his work is very heavy, but I mean, he says that there's 7 different creation stories in the Bible. If that's true, you know, and I even argue there's more. But you know, I mean, how important is that relationship that we have with creation? Well, we're good.
Indestructible.
Exactly.
I just heard about a new book by Karen Armstrong
Yes.
that I'm really interested in. I don't know if you know about it, but it's called Sacred Nature, Restoring Our Ancient Bond with the Natural World. But she looks across all religions, kind of, that's her
Oh, yeah.
thing, right? It's the world religion.
Totally.
Perspective.
No, Karen Armstrong's fantastic stuff.
So sacralizing nature for modern times. Yeah, it might be interesting.
It is, yeah. I mean, it is a burgeoning field. Creation care. I'm all fuzzy on the screen. But that's because something else. I don't know how to fix that. But that's no, but that's fine. That doesn't have anything to do with this. I can try to zoom in a little bit. I don't know. Sorry, everybody at home.
Hey, at least you have sound this week.
That's a win.
We didn't have sound for him.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's a burgeoning field. Broadleaf, so Broadleaf Press, which is the they didn't publish this book of Randy Woodley's, but another one and this one are really doing a lot of really cool stuff in that space. And I mean, you know, Karen Armstrong could talk about anything, and I want to read it. She's absolutely amazing. Absolutely.
We've learned a lot about your thinking and background.
Yeah.
A little bit about your wife. Tell us about your children.
So I have 2 children, Joseph, who is 10, and Mary, who turns 7 tomorrow. Pretty awesome. A lot of people are like, hey, you named your kids, you know, you're very on brand, Presbyterian pastor with Mary and Joseph. They are, you know, family names, you know. My mom's middle name is Mary. Tons of uncles and aunts have Mary or Joe as their names. Yeah, you know, I mean, the thing about children is that they make your life incredibly full. And I have a very hard time wondering what life was like before they were there. You know, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's who they are. They both like soccer. Mary does ballet, swim, scouts, you know.
You want to move over so they can see you?
Yeah, I mean, they're not seeing me anyway because it's fuzzy. Oh! Maybe. I mean, it's still just this.
Oh.
But, I don't know. Sorry, everybody at home.
Impressionist.
Exactly.
Warm and fuzzy.
I'm going with that. Cool. Well, thank you all so much. Wonderful information for creating this. It's great design.